Most people know the name Alexander the Great, but few truly understand the man behind the legend. Have you ever wondered how a young man from Little Macedonia managed to conquer the largest empire in the world before the age of 30? How he defeated colossal armies, crushed civilizations, and founded cities that still exist today? The real story of Alexander isn't just about battles. It's about strategy, ambition, and a vision that surpassed the limits of his own time. If you think his story is limited to a talented king winning battles, you're mistaken. Alexander didn't just win. He rewrote the rules of war, politics, and culture. He didn't just destroy empires. He built a new world. But was his legacy truly glorious? Or did his relentless pursuit of conquests hide a darker side that few know? About what truly made Alexander the Great? Was it his genius on the battlefield, his ability to manipulate people and cultures, or his obsession with becoming more than a man, a god? Get ready to dive into the true history of the greatest conqueror who ever lived, filled with betrayals, impossible strategies, legendary battles, and a destiny as epic as it was tragic. And in the end, an inevitable question. If you were in his place, would you have done things differently? Greece's fate was sealed long before Alexander the Great emerged on the horizon. The war between Athens and Sparta wasn't just a military conflict. It was an open wound that drained the vigor of both city-states. The rivalry among the Greek polis, instead of creating a strong nation, led to chaos and exhaustion. Macedonia, which had until then been seen as a peripheral kingdom, patiently awaited its turn. When the opportunity finally arose, Philip II didn't hesitate. After all, while the Greeks were wasting time fighting each other, he was training his army for something much bigger. Greece's mistake was believing that the world revolved around its glorious past. The culture was still rich, philosophy was flourishing, but the warriors no longer had the same drive as before. Sparta, the city of the legendary hoplites, saw its number of citizens drastically decrease, becoming irrelevant in the military scene. Athens, once the undisputed naval power, was sinking in political disputes and power plays. Meanwhile, Macedonia was building its own identity, refining its strategy and watching, calculating. The Greeks were still debating the past, but the future already belonged to another people. Philip II not only understood the right moment to act, he created that moment. Inspired by Theban tactics, he saw beyond the trenches, realizing that war wasn't won just with swords, but with intelligence. When Greece woke up to the danger, it was already too late. The walls that had protected Athens from Persian invasion wouldn't be able to stop the Macedonian war machine. Instead of resisting, many Greeks began to see Philip not as a conqueror, but as a possible savior. Irony or pragmatism, it didn't matter. If there's a lesson in this decline, it's that the greatest danger to any empire isn't outside its borders, it's within. Greece wasn't defeated by a superior army at first, but by its own inability to unite. And this is a truth that repeats throughout history. How many companies, empires, and even personal dreams fall apart because their leaders are busy fighting among themselves? Macedonia understood that war wasn't just a matter of strength, but of timing. And Greece's time had run out. But if Philip II was the great architect of this new era, it was only the beginning of the spectacle. Destiny reserved something even grander for Macedonia, and his name was already echoing in the halls of power: Alexander. Philip II wasn't just a king, he was a born strategist, a man who understood war not as a simple clash of forces, but as a chess game where each piece had its role. Trained under the legendary Epaminondas of Thebes, Philip learned that war wasn't won just with courage, but with strategy. This is how he took a rough Macedonian army and transformed it into the deadliest. force of his time. If the Spartans were feared for their discipline, Philip surpassed them by creating an adaptable, cohesive, and innovative war machine. And the greatest of these innovations, the introduction of the sarissa, a 6-meter spear that gave Macedonian soldiers a much longer reach than their enemies. Imagine a battlefield where each of your strikes hits the opponent before they even get close. This completely changed the dynamics of war. The Macedonian phalanx, armed with these enormous spears, became an impenetrable wall. It was like facing a forest of steel, where each soldier was a sharp branch ready to pierce anyone who dared to approach. But Philip didn't stop there. He understood that the rigidity of the traditional phalanx had a weakness. It was predictable. So he added mobility to the equation. Inspired by Epaminondas's oblique tactic, he created flexible formations that allowed attacking flanks, exploiting gaps, and destabilizing larger armies. It was like turning a wall into a swarm of deadly swords. He also improved the cavalry, making it an offensive force rather than just support. Under his leadership, the Macedonian cavalry companions became the elite on the battlefield, a true shock force. Now think about this. How many leaders throughout history clung to the past and failed? Philip understood something fundamental: innovation. It isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. In the business world, for example, companies that don't innovate are swallowed by those that adapt. Look at giants like Blockbuster and Kodak, which ignored the digital revolution and paid the price. Philip didn't make that mistake. He didn't just learn from the best, he surpassed them. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because everything Philip built, every tactic, every innovation, every masterstroke, wasn't the end game. It was just the board being set for the real match. And who would step onto the field to play? Alexander, his own son. Philip II didn't just want to modernize Macedonia, he wanted to dominate it. And that meant facing his Greek neighbors, who still saw the Macedonians as barbarians. But Philip wasn't a barbarian, he was a visionary. He started by conquering territories to the north, consolidating internal power, and ensuring that no one would threaten his kingdom, while he turned his attention to the real prize, Greece. The path there wouldn't be easy, but Philip was ready for any battle. First, he had to deal with the Thracians and Illyrians, fierce tribes that had long haunted Macedonia. But against the Macedonian phalanx, their rudimentary tactics were no match. Philip crushed them and incorporated their warriors into his own army, turning enemies into allies. This gave him more soldiers, more resources, and above all, more confidence to face the Greeks in the south. With Macedonia now strengthened, it was time to confront the real rivals, Athens and Thebes. The great battle came in 338 BC at Cheronea. Philip faced a combined army of Athenians and Thebans, a definitive test for his military innovations. But he had something the Greeks didn't. Alexander, his son, who was only 18 at the time and led the Macedonian cavalry. In the decisive moment, Alexander charged the Theban elite, the famous Sacred Band, and annihilated them. It was a massacre. With this, Greek resistance was broken, and Macedonia finally dominated Greece. Now, Philip wasn't just a king, he was the master of Greece. But instead of destroying the conquered cities, he did something unexpected. He proposed unity. He created the League of Corinth, an alliance among the Greeks led by Macedonia, with one goal in mind: to invade Persia. That was the masterstroke. Instead of ruling by brute force, he offered the Greeks a greater cause, a common enemy. If before they fought among themselves, now they could avenge the Persian Empire. And who better to lead them on this mission than Philip? But destiny had other plans. Philip II barely had time to savor his victory. A brutal assassination would take him off the scene, paving the way for a new leader. Someone young, fearless, and ready to take Macedonia beyond the limits of the known world. His name, Alexander Philip II, was at the height of his power, ready to invade Persia when the unexpected happened. A fatal blow at his own wedding party, assassination. With the king's death, the Macedonian throne was vacant, and no one was more prepared to take it than Alexander. But there was a problem, there always is. Even as Philip's son, he needed to prove he was worthy of the title, and in that era, royalty wasn't guaranteed, it was earned. Many generals and nobles thought they could take the throne for themselves. A fatal mistake. Alexander didn't waste time. In a swift and calculated move, he eliminated all possible rivals. Some were killed, others simply disappeared. The young king couldn't afford to hesitate. Meanwhile, the Greek cities saw Philip's death as an opportunity to rid themselves of Macedonian domination. Thebes, always rebellious, decided to test the new king. An even bigger mistake. Alexander didn't send emissaries, didn't try to negotiate. He marched straight to Thebes with an entire army. The city was razed, the walls were torn down, the citizens massacred or sold into slavery. Alexander didn't do this out of cruelty, but to send a clear message: don't challenge Macedonia. The message was understood. Athens and Sparta, which were considering resisting, immediately gave up. The new king wasn't just Philip's son, he was even more ruthless when necessary. But there was something deeper behind his actions. He didn't just want to consolidate the throne. He wanted the world, and for that, he needed something bigger than Greece. He needed to follow his father's plan, the invasion of Persia. But Alexander wasn't Philip. He didn't just want historical revenge for the Persian attacks on Greece centuries earlier. He wanted something much more ambitious, to build an empire that surpassed all previous ones. And for that, he needed to be more than a Macedonian king. He needed to become a god of war. The drums of invasion were beginning to echo. Persia was a giant, a vast and rich empire ruled by Darius III. But Alexander wasn't intimidated. On the contrary, he looked to the horizon and saw a challenge. And for someone like him, challenges weren't obstacles. They were invitations. The war was about to begin. If Philip II built the Macedonian war machine, Alexander the Great perfected every gear. He didn't just inherit a highly trained army, he transformed it into an almost supernatural force. His genius wasn't just in strategy, but in adaptability. While other generals followed rigid formulas, Alexander read the battlefield like a chess, master anticipating each move of his opponent. If the phalanx was the backbone of his army, flexibility was his true weapon. The key to his success was the mix of troops. Instead of relying solely on the inflexible Macedonian phalanx, Alexander incorporated archers, light troops, Greek mercenaries, and most importantly, his legendary cavalry. The companions, the elite mounted unit, weren't just soldiers. They were the sharp blade of every battle. Alexander led them personally, breaking enemy formations at the exact moment. He understood that a victorious army wasn't the one that resisted the longest, but the one that attacked at the right point, at the right time. But Alexander's strength wasn't just in his weapons, it was in his mind. He studied his enemies, understood their weaknesses, and used them against them. Against the Persians, for example, he noticed that their army relied on numerical strength and the power of war chariots. What did he do? He created tactics to open gaps in the enemy infantry and destabilize the chariots before they could wreak havoc. On the battlefield, he never repeated the same approach. It was like a martial arts master adapting his style as the fight progressed, and the impact went beyond combat. He knew that the army's morale was everything. That's why he fought on the front lines, risked his life, and inspired his men with almost suicidal acts of bravery. The soldiers saw in him a leader who not only commanded, but shared the same dangers. The result? an army willing to follow him to the ends of the earth. And when an army blindly believes in its leader, it becomes unstoppable, and this unwavering belief would soon be tested. Because Alexander wasn't interested in small conquests, his sights were set on the greatest prize of all, the Persian Empire, a vast, rich and powerful empire ruled by Darius III. But Alexander didn't see an empire, he saw an adversary waiting to fall. And his march toward glory was just beginning. Greece's revenge against Persia was an ancient desire. But for Alexander the Great, it was just a pretext. He didn't just want to retaliate against Xerxes and Darius's attacks. He wanted to take everything for himself. In 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont with about 40,000 soldiers, launching a campaign that would change history. And he knew the first battle would be decisive. If he lost, his campaign would end before it even began. But Alexander wasn't made to lose. The first clash happened at the Granicus River, where a Persian army tried to block his advance. Darius's generals underestimated Alexander, thinking he would hesitate to cross the river under attack. Big mistake. Without waiting, Alexander personally led the cavalry charge, crossing the waters while his soldiers faced the chaos. Within hours, the Persian army was crushed. It was a devastating psychological blow. The young Macedonian king wasn't an ordinary warrior, he was a storm. But the great battle was yet to come. The following year, Darius III, the Persian king, gathered a colossal army to stop him at Issus. For any ordinary general, facing a much larger enemy would be a nightmare. For Alexander, it was an opportunity. He used the mountainous terrain to his advantage, forcing the Persians to fight in a confined space where their numerical superiority was useless. When he encountered Darius, he launched a direct attack on the center of the enemy army. The Persian king, terrified, fled the battlefield, abandoning his own army and family. The victory at Issus cemented Alexander as an invincible monster. If, before the Persians saw him as just an ambitious young king, they now understood they were dealing with an unparalleled conqueror. And if Darius thought he could hide and reorganize his forces, he was wrong. Alexander wouldn't give him time to do so. He wasn't satisfied with just winning. He wanted to humiliate the Persian Empire. But before continuing his march toward Persia, he needed to solve a strategic problem: the city fortress of Tyre, a Persian jewel that, if not conquered, could threaten his dominance over the Mediterranean. And Alexander didn't leave loose ends. The siege of Tyre would be one of the most brutal in history. If there was a city that didn't want to fall, it was Tyre. The Phoenician fortress, located on a well-protected island, was one of the most important ports of the Persian Empire. For Alexander, capturing it wasn't just a matter of conquest, it was a strategic necessity. If Tyre remained standing, Persia would still have a foothold in the Mediterranean, but there was a problem. Tyre couldn't be simply invaded. Surrounded by the sea and protected by impenetrable walls, the city was prepared to resist. Most generals would have given up. Not Alexander. If the city was by the sea, he would build a path to it. Yes, literally. He ordered his men to construct an artificial causeway almost a kilometer long, connecting the mainland to the island. It was an unthinkable feat, but the Macedonians worked day and night, stone by stone, wood by wood. The Tyrians watched, first in disbelief, then in terror. What seemed impossible was happening right before their eyes. When the Macedonians finally reached the walls, the defenders desperately tried to stop the assault. Arrows, Greek fire, surprise attacks, nothing stopped Alexander. He brought siege towers, catapults, and, most brutally of all, his relentless determination. After 7 months of resistance, Tyre fell. What followed was a massacre. About 10,000 men were killed, and 30,000 were sold into slavery. Alexander wasn't merciful to those who resisted. The city was sacked, and the Persian Empire lost one of its most valuable ports. This brutality wasn't gratuitous. It was a warning. Alexander didn't have time for games. Either enemies surrendered or faced total destruction. Many rulers understood the message and submitted without resistance, but the young king wouldn't stop there. He was already eyeing the next big prize. There was a rich land with an ancient culture and a people who, unlike Tyre, would welcome him not as an invader, but as a liberator. It was time to move on to Egypt. After the destruction of Tyre, Alexander the Great moved on to one of the most coveted territories of the ancient world, Egypt. But this time, there would be no need for bloody battles or endless sieges. The Egyptians, tired of Persian rule, saw Alexander as a liberator. When he entered the country, he was greeted as a hero without needing to draw a sword. The Persian governor simply handed over control, and the Egyptian priests, always attentive to the power game, did something even more surprising. They crowned Alexander as Pharaoh. Being Pharaoh of Egypt wasn't just a title, it meant being considered a living god. And Alexander, who already carried boundless ambition, realized the power this gave him. He wasn't just a foreign king ruling a distant land. Now, he was part of Egyptian mythology, a sacred figure with divine right to reign. But he didn't stay in Memphis or the Nile Delta to enjoy his new position. Instead, he did something few conquerors would do. He founded his own city. Thus was born Alexandria, the first of several cities that would bear his name. But this wasn't just any city, it was a promise of immortality. Alexander wanted to create a center of culture, commerce, and knowledge that would last forever. He chose a strategic location near the sea where his vision would take shape. Alexandria would grow and become one of the most important intellectual hubs of the ancient world, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria and the cradle of great thinkers. But at that moment, for Alexander, it was just the beginning. Before leaving Egypt, he did something even more enigmatic. He traveled to the Siwa Oasis, a sacred place for the Egyptians and home to the Oracle of Amun. Alexander wanted an answer. Who was he really? Just a king or something more? The Oracle gave him a mysterious answer, and whatever he heard, he never revealed it publicly. But from that moment on, Alexander began to act as if he had a divine destiny. He was no longer just a conqueror. He saw himself as the chosen one to rule the world, but before achieving that ambition, he had a pending matter. Darius III, king of Persia, was still alive, and Alexander didn't accept rivals. His next step would be one of the most impressive battles in history, where he would face a much larger army and still come out victorious. He had no more doubts. The world was his to take. The Persian Empire was on the brink of collapse, but Darius III still wasn't ready to surrender. After the humiliating defeat at Issus, he gathered a colossal army to stop Alexander once and for all. At Gaugamela, in the heart of Mesopotamia, Darius played his last card. With an estimated force of 250,000 men, he intended to crush the Macedonians through sheer numerical superiority. But Alexander wasn't intimidated. He knew that numbers alone don't win wars. Strategy does. The battlefield was chosen by the Persians, who even leveled the terrain to use their war chariots with blades. But Alexander studied the enemy like a hunter analyzes his prey. He noticed that Darius always tried to flank his troops, and this time he would use that against him. When the Persians attacked the sides of the Macedonian army, Alexander did something unexpected. He deliberately opened a gap in the center of the battle line. Darius, thinking he finally had the advantage, ordered a direct advance. That was his fatal mistake. At that exact moment, Alexander and his elite companion cavalry advanced through the unprotected center of the Persian army and headed straight for Darius. Chaos ensued. The Persian king, terrified at the sight of Alexander, coming towards him, fled for the second time, abandoning his army to its fate. What followed was a massacre. Without their leader, the Persians panicked, their formations broke, and thousands were slaughtered. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the world for centuries, was officially defeated. The sack of Babylon and Persepolis was inevitable. Alexander marched triumphantly through the Persian capitals, taking their riches, their palaces, and their symbols of power. In a symbolic gesture, he ordered the destruction of Xerxes' palace as revenge for the Persian attacks on Greece decades earlier. The ancient world understood the message. Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He was redrawing the map of history with fire and sword. But something changed in him after this victory. If before he saw Persia as an enemy, he now began to see it as part of his empire. Instead of crushing Persian culture, he started adopting their customs. He dressed like a Persian king, adopted local nobility traditions, and even encouraged marriages between his soldiers and Persian women. This would create tensions among his generals, who still saw Persia as a defeated enemy. But Alexander didn't see borders. He saw a unified empire. His gaze was already turned eastward. He wanted to go beyond Persia, beyond what any Greek or Macedonian had ever dreamed. And the next destination, the mysterious lands of the Indus Valley. Victory over Persia changed Alexander the Great, and not just militarily. Before, he was the young king of Macedonia, conqueror of Greece, avenger of Greece against the Persians. Now he was the lord of a colossal empire, larger than any before him. But governing an empire is very different from conquering it. And Alexander didn't just want to rule. He wanted something much bigger, to unify the world under a single government, a single culture, and a single leader, himself. To do this, he began adopting Persian customs, dressing like an Eastern king, and demanding that his generals and soldiers bow before him, the Persian ritual of proskynesis. For the Persians, this was normal. For the Macedonians and Greeks, an outrage. They didn't see Alexander as a god, but as a warrior like themselves. Tensions grew between him and his commanders. But Alexander believed he couldn't govern an empire with the support of just one people. He needed to integrate Persians and Macedonians into a new identity. He went further. In a bold gesture, he married Roxana, a Persian princess, and encouraged his officers to do the same. Over 10,000 Macedonian soldiers married Persian women in a ceremony organized by Alexander himself. He wanted his men to stop seeing Persians as enemies and start seeing them as brothers. But for many, this was too much. His army had fought the Persians for years, and now Alexander wanted them to become a single nation. Many didn't accept this idea. The breaking point came when he started replacing Macedonian commanders with Persian officers. His own generals began to question his judgment. Was he still the same king who crossed the Hellespont years before? Or had the grandeur of the empire gone to his head? A symbolic episode of this conflict was the execution of Clitus the Black, a loyal general of Alexander who saved him at the Battle of the Granicus River. In a fit of rage during an argument, Alexander killed Clitus with his own hands. The shock was immediate. He realized what he had done, but it was already too late. Still, Alexander continued his march. He was no longer just the king of Macedonia, nor just the conqueror of Persia. He saw himself as the ruler of the world. But ruling the world means going to its ends. And for Alexander, there was still one territory left to conquer, the Indies. For any other ruler, dominating Greece, Persia, and Egypt would have been more than enough. But Alexander the Great didn't think like others. His desire for conquest, knew no bounds. If the known world went as far as India, then that was where he would march. In 327 BC, he led his army beyond the Persian Empire toward the unknown. But this wouldn't be an ordinary campaign. It would be his greatest trial. Arriving in the Indus Valley region wasn't just a cultural shock, but a military challenge like no other. Unlike the organized Persian armies, the Indian kingdoms had guerrilla tactics, natural fortresses, and a weapon the Macedonians had never faced: war elephants. Alexander knew he was facing an enemy he couldn't underestimate, but he also knew that the key to victory wasn't brute force. It was strategy. The biggest confrontation happened in 326 BC at the Battle of the Hydaspes River against King Porus. The Indians were well positioned, protected by the river and with a large army. But Alexander, as always, found an unexpected solution. During the night, he divided his troops and crossed the river at an unexpected point, catching the Indians by surprise. The combat was brutal. The war elephants terrified the Macedonians, crushing entire ranks. But Alexander didn't retreat. He ordered precise attacks on the animals' eyes and legs, destabilizing the enemy formation. When King Porus was captured, instead of humiliating him, Alexander did something different. He kept him as an ally and appointed him governor of the region. But despite the victory, something was different. The Macedonian army, which had followed him to the ends of the earth without question, was now at its limit. They had been away from home for over a decade, fighting endless battles. When Alexander announced he wanted to continue advancing eastward, toward the unknown, the soldiers refused. For the first time, his army said no. It was a hard blow for him, but Alexander knew he couldn't fight his own troops. Reluctantly, he decided to turn back. But the return wouldn't be easy. The journey back through the Gedrosian desert was one of the most difficult episodes of his campaign. Thousands of soldiers died of hunger and thirst. It seemed that nature was testing his endurance as much as the enemies he had faced, and so the greatest conqueror in history began his journey back. But something awaited him along the way. It wasn't a battle nor an empire to be conquered. It was his own destiny, which was soon to come to an end. 10 years. That was the time Alexander the Great took to conquer the largest empire the world had ever seen. He had marched from Macedonia to India, defeated colossal armies, toppled kings, founded cities, and created an empire that blended the West and the East. But ironically, the warrior who never lost a battle was defeated by the only enemy he couldn't face: death. In 323 BC, back in Babylon, Alexander began planning his next campaign, the conquest of Arabia. But before he could set out, he was struck by a mysterious fever. Some say it was malaria, others believe it was poisoning. The fact is, within a few days, the man who seemed invincible was on the brink of death. His generals, desperate, asked who he would leave his empire to. His answer was as enigmatic as his fate: to the strongest. But the truth is, no one was strong enough to replace Alexander. His death left a massive power vacuum. His generals, the so-called diadochi, soon clashed, each wanting their piece of the empire. What Alexander built in life crumbled in a few years. His empire was divided. The Egypt went to Ptolemy, Persia to Seleucus, and Macedonia to Antigonus. The dream of a unified empire died with him, but Alexander had already secured his immortality. His name would echo through the centuries, inspiring emperors, generals, and conquerors. Julius Caesar mourned seeing one of his statues, lamenting not having conquered as much as he did. Napoleon obsessively studied his campaigns. Even today, his name still resonates as a synonym for greatness, ambition, and power. And his body. Even in death, Alexander remained a legend. Ptolemy took his corpse to Egypt and placed it in a golden sarcophagus in Alexandria. Leaders like Augustus visited his tomb, but over time, his remains disappeared. To this day, no one knows for sure where Alexander's body is, as if destiny itself wanted him to remain shrouded in mystery. But his legacy didn't end with his death, because something even more powerful was just beginning: the Hellenistic era, where his culture, vision, and conquests would shape the future. The death of Alexander the Great wasn't just the end of a man, it was the beginning of a new era. His empire might have fragmented, but his influence was impossible to erase. What he left behind wasn't just a territory divided among ambitious generals, but a cultural, scientific, and philosophical revolution that would change the world forever. The Hellenistic world was born. Alexander's generals, known as the Diadochi, fought among themselves for control of his empire. The result? 3 great kingdoms rose from the ashes: the Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Persia, and Antigonid Macedonia. Ptolemy, who took Egypt, founded a dynasty that would rule for nearly 300 years, ending only with Cleopatra. Seleucus inherited the vast region of Persia and Central Asia, while Antigonus and his descendants tried to keep Macedonia and Greece united. Alexander's empire had died, but his culture hadn't. Alexandria, the city he founded in Egypt, became the intellectual center of the world. It was there that the famous Library of Alexandria was born, gathering the knowledge of various civilizations. Mathematicians like Euclid and scientists like Aristarchus of Samos, who suggested that the Earth orbited the Sun, flourished under the Hellenistic influence. Alexander's impact went far beyond war. He planted the seeds of thought that would shape science, art, and philosophy for centuries. But the biggest change was the cultural blend. For the first time, the West and the East were deeply connected. Greeks, Egyptians, Persians, and Indians began to share ideas, customs, and technologies. The style of government, art, and even religion started to reflect this fusion. Alexander may have died, but his vision of a unified world lived on through this synthesis of cultures. And so Alexander's mark remained indelible. He didn't just conquer lands, he conquered time. His name would echo through generations, inspiring everything from Roman emperors to modern generals. But his story wasn't over yet, because centuries later, there's still something fascinating about the young king of Macedonia who dared to challenge the world and almost succeeded. Alexander the Great's journey is a brutal reminder that ambition can lead a man to conquer the world, but it can also destroy it. He never lost a battle, but he lost everything he built shortly after his death. His empire crumbled, his generals fought for power, and his vision of a unified world disappeared. But his name was never forgotten. And now I ask you, what can we learn from Alexander? What made him such an irresistible leader, such a brilliant strategist, and an eternal symbol of power? He didn't wait for opportunities, he created them. He didn't fear challenges, he faced them head-on. And perhaps that's the great lesson. History doesn't remember those who wait, but those who dare to act. Now think about your own life. Are you waiting for the right moment? Or are you creating your own destiny? Are you facing your challenges or running from them like Darius III? What are you doing today to be remembered tomorrow? If you enjoyed this content and want to continue exploring history like you've never seen it before, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your comment below. Who knows? In the next video, we might uncover another great character who shaped the world.